Welcome to Cracked, the podcast, the program that slays the dragons of mental health by stripping away the shame, embarrassment, fear, and stigma. Because mental health isn't something that affects just some of us, it applies to all of us. Here to shine a new light on areas of mental health that often go unvisited are your hosts, Rebecca Shaper and Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome to Crack the Podcast with me, Sandy Sedgbeer.
And me, Rebecca Shaper.
Worldwide, depression will be the single biggest cause of disability in the next 20 years. But treatment for it has not changed much in the last 3 decades. In the world of psychiatry, time has apparently stood still. Until now. Our guest today is world expert in neuroscience and mental health, Professor Edward Bullmore, whose game-changing bestseller, The Inflamed Mind, A Radical New Approach to Depression, reveals the breakthrough new science on the link between depression and inflammation of the body and brain. Ed Bullmore trained in medicine at the University of Oxford and St Bartholomew's Hospital, London, and then in psychiatry at the Bethlehem Royal and Maudsley Hospital, London. He moved to Cambridge as Professor of Psychiatry in 1999 and was head of the Department of Psychiatry from 2014 to 21. He's currently director of the Wolfson Brain Imaging Centre and deputy head of the School of Clinical Medicine, and he's published more than 500 highly cited scientific papers. Professor Ed Bullmore, welcome.
Welcome, thank you.
Now, the inflamed mind represents a whole new way of looking at how mind, brain and body all work together, and it offers insights into how we could start getting to grips with depression and other mental disorders much more effectively in the future. Before we dive deeper into the link between inflammation and depression, would you share with us the aha moment you had about this after an episode in your dentist's chair?
Yeah. I'm fortunate in that I don't have much personal experience of chronic or long-term inflammatory problems, but one thing I do have is some dodgy teeth, and I went to a dentist for a root canal treatment. And the dentist was scraping around in there and getting out all the gunge and fixing the tooth. And I went home and found myself feeling quite a bit low. Not particularly energetic. Didn't really want to talk to anybody. Just went to bed and lay there, sort of cogitating rather gloomily about what this meant. And I found myself thinking, maybe, I'm feeling a bit sad, a bit depressed after this dental treatment, because it's telling me that I am literally getting long in the tooth. My days are limited. So I took initially rather a sort of psychological interpretation of it, that my mental reaction, my emotional reaction to the dental surgery was because I was thinking about the implications of what had happened and what it meant about how old I was, how much time I had left, etc. And then I thought, well, maybe there's another explanation, which is that my tooth was infected, it was inflamed. The dentist, in fixing it, was poking around in there, would have stimulated more of an inflammatory response. And maybe my emotional reaction isn't so much that I'm just thinking about being long in the tooth, but I've actually experienced a little spike of inflammation, and that's pushed my mental state into a slightly different direction. Now, hasten to add that I've got no evidence that is the case. I mean, I didn't measure my levels of inflammation before and after I'd had the dental treatment, but it's certainly consistent with a lot of other evidence that we have for inflammation being relevant to depression. And I used it in the book as a way in to tell the story. That's, sometimes when we think about depression, we tend to think it is all in the mind, and if I'm feeling a bit gloomy after I've had let's say a dental operation, that's because of the way I'm thinking about it. But there are alternative ways of thinking about where depression comes from, and inflammation is one of them.
My question to that is, did they put you on antibiotics, or did you just go without antibiotics? I'm just curious.
No, there were no antibiotics. No, it was just a sort of straight surgical procedure.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I don't want to get too sort of gory about it, but I mean, there definitely was, it turned out there definitely was a bit of a sort of localized infection at the root of the tooth, and I think sorting that out and getting rid of it, will have, I think, likely released some of that infection into the bloodstream, or stimulated an inflammatory response locally. I suppose the other thing that story tells us, and maybe it's just worth reminding ourselves about it, is that, inflammation is, we tend to think of inflammation as quite localized. So if a part of your body becomes inflamed, it becomes red and swollen and tender, and you can look at it and think, well, that's where the inflammation is. But actually what we now know about the immune system is that even if it looks as if it's a local problem, inflammation tends to be quite systemic. It tends to trigger the release of these cytokines, so-called. I think of them as kind of the immune system's hormones, and they travel through the bloodstream, and they have effects on multiple different organs, including, I think, the brain. So the other thing about that little dental episode is it just reminds us that inflammation, even if it seems to be local, restricted just to a tooth or some other part of your body, it is likely having effects that you can measure throughout the body.
That was going to be my next question, was how and why does inflammation in the body affect the brain and cause depression? Is there anything else you would like to add to that?
Well, I think, I think there's a ton of evidence that inflammation and depression are associated with each other. I actually think that's beyond reasonable doubt. And there are two lines of evidence that I would sort of draw on to support that claim. I mean, one is that if you have a sort of medical inflammatory disorder like arthritis, psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease, patients with that as the principal diagnosis, if you ask them questions about mood, anxiety, you will find that that's very common, that psychological symptoms of that sort go together with inflammatory disease of the body. And the other important line of evidence is if you start from patients who have severe depression, but no obvious bodily disease, and you test levels of inflammatory proteins in the blood of those depressed patients and compare them to healthy, non-depressed people, there are significant increases in inflammatory protein levels circulating in people who don't appear to be inflamed clinically. They wouldn't think of themselves as having an inflammatory disease necessarily, but nevertheless, when you do the tests and you do the measurements, there's evidence that inflammation is present. It's not the same high levels that you would see in inflammatory bowel disease or arthritis, let's say, but it's nevertheless significantly increased compared to normal. So you put those two things together. A lot of people with medical inflammatory disease are depressed. A lot of people with depression have low-grade inflammation. I think that amounts to pretty conclusive evidence that the two things are associated with each other. The key question is about causality. Does that association represent a causal relationship? Is inflammation actually causing depression? Yeah. And that is a rather crucial question. And I do spend a lot of time in the book talking about that, and perhaps we want to talk about that a bit more today.
Yeah. One of the things that became very clear to me in your book is how blinkered how restrained we are in our thinking. And time again, we dismiss things, as you pointed out with your stories about Mrs. P, one of the first people you ever came across in your career that, raised this question in your head, is that we dismiss these things and say, well, of course, you would be depressed if you've got, Crohn's disease or IBS, or you've got this or you've got that, or you just lost your wife, or, we don't ever think to look at the other reasons. And this is what you are exposing very well in this book. When I was reading the number of things that can actually cause inflammation in the body, it's you can't separate it anymore from life, because you've got bereavement, you've got loss of a loved one, maybe through divorce, you've got shocks to the body, you've got all kinds of things, even periodontal disease. So it's just surprising that nobody's picked up on it before.
Yes, well, I mean, so I must say that I'm not by any means the first person to have picked up on this. I mean, this is a story that's been growing scientifically for the last 10 or 15 years at least, I would say. But your point about sort of this relationship between depression and inflammation sort of hiding in plain sight, if I can use that expression, it's once your eyes are open to it, or your mind is open to it, actually you can see it everywhere, but it isn't part of standard Western medical thinking.
Right.
And I think that is an important sort of fault line in a way through medicine at the moment. We tend to think the mind and the body is quite separate, and we see that in how doctors are trained. If you decide to specialize in the body, you go off and become a physician through a different training path than if you decide to become a specialist in disorders of the mind and a psychiatrist. There's at least in the UK, there's a very separate training tracks. So they separate individuals out. And then if you're a patient, you tend to be seen either in a mental health services clinic or an acute medical clinic. And again, those are usually different organizations, different places. So in every way, the treatment of the mind and body tends to be separated. And certainly when I was at medical school, which admittedly was quite a few years ago now, I'm talking sort of 1980s, we were taught, as a matter of fact, then that the immune system in particular had nothing to do with the brain or the mind, because there was something called the blood-brain barrier that sort of existed a bit like the Berlin Wall in the brain to prevent the immune system, the cells and proteins of the immune system that circulate in the blood couldn't get into the brain and couldn't make a difference to mental state, it was believed. But one of the exciting things I think about science in general, and certainly this area of science, is that new discoveries can disrupt the way that we think about things. And certainly the idea that the brain is completely protected from the immune system by this impermeable blood-brain barrier, as I was taught in the 1980s, that is no longer credible. And we now know that there are many channels of communication between the immune system and the brain. And perhaps unsurprisingly, in the light of hindsight, it's all joined up. The immune system and the nervous system talk to each other all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's therefore conceivable that an arthritis or some other cause of inflammation in the body could have effects on the brain, could have effects in the mind. So this is a new way of thinking about things that science has allowed us to take seriously in recent years. But it does butt up against decades, if not hundreds of years of medical tradition, which is to think about mind and brain as completely separate and impossible that they should have anything to do with each other. So it's science butting up against tradition, which is a familiar story, actually, if you look in the history of science. But I think it's an exciting time, actually, to be thinking differently about depression.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. You say that vaccination is a good example of a safe inflammatory shock that transiently causes a depressive state. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think going back to this question about causality, how do you prove that inflammation causes depression?
Right.
In animal research, it's quite easy to address that question, because you can take a perfectly healthy animal and you can make them inflamed. And when people do that, they very repeatedly, consistently see that you change the animal's behavior. And obviously, when we're talking about humans, there are limits to what we can do along similar lines. We can't make people infected to see if they become depressed, for example. So we need to find safe ways of causing an inflammatory shock, and vaccines are one way of doing that. And of course, the one particular vaccine that's quite famous for this is typhoid vaccine. If you're vaccinated against typhoid, a lot of people experience a couple of days of feeling a bit off color, a bit blue. It generally doesn't amount to a sort of severe, serious episode of depression, but nevertheless, a lot of people do experience changes in mood and behavior for a couple of days after a typhoid vaccine. And people scientifically have used that as a way of getting at this question of causality. So if you give somebody a shot of vaccine, you can see that they were perfectly well before, and then there are changes in mood that you can measure afterwards. And what's more, you can see changes in how the brain is working as a result of the inflammatory shock that you've induced by the vaccination. So this is important as a way of trying to get at the question of causality and try and move the story on from simply there being an association between inflammation and depression to make the stronger case that actually inflammation can be causal.
There's something that occurs to me. You wrote the book in 2018. We've had the pandemic since then.
Yeah.
We've learned an awful lot. The average person has learned an awful lot about the immune system. We know that depression has rocketed. So, the statistics quoted in your book, probably there's been a jump since then. A lot of people were doing whatever they could, whether it was taking supplements, different things to build their immune system, because they heard that's what they needed to fight the pandemic. They needed to fight the virus, a strong immune system. But of course, if you overstimulate the immune system, you get in danger of getting a cytokine storm. At the same time, people are having vaccinations, which, as you just said, create this safe kind of response. But somewhere in there, it almost feels as though we are contributing to the inflammation story. In trying to cure these things, we're also contributing to the factors with the vaccinations, with trying to support our immune system to fight the virus. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think, COVID certainly has some very interesting implications for this story. Because if you look at what's happening with people who have been infected with the virus, what we are seeing very, very clearly is quite serious percentage of those patients, even if their initial illness wasn't that severe, are coping with prolonged symptoms of fatigue, depression, anxiety, mild cognitive impairment. All of this is emerging quite clearly as a consequence of the viral infection. And we and many other people around the world are trying to understand why that is. And there are a number of possibilities, and I don't know that it's not known for certain what the cause of those kind of long COVID type symptoms might be. But I think the inflammatory response to the virus is quite a prime candidate. And certainly, there is already a little bit of evidence that, for example, the changes in the brain that you can see in people that have had COVID look like they're correlated with measures of inflammation that you can measure in the blood at the same time as the scanning was done in those patients. So that's a bit of preliminary evidence that these post-COVID psychological symptoms might have their origins in the immune response to the virus. And of course, that would be compatible with the general idea in my book that inflammation of the body can have a causal effect on mood. So COVID is an area where I'm very keen to do more research, and I think many others around the world are thinking likewise. This is an opportunity really to discover in more detail what goes on after viral infection and how that can affect mood. I mean, in terms of vaccination, I just want to say unequivocally that I think the balance of risk and benefit is clearly in favor of having a vaccine. The consequences of having a coronavirus infection are much more serious for your mental health, never mind your physical health, than the relatively transient minor mood symptoms that people might experience after a vaccine. So I am unequivocally pro-vaccine. I'm delighted I've had 2 jabs myself, and I really didn't think twice about that when the opportunity came around. So I think the kind of inflammatory response that you see from a vaccine is relatively mild, and it's brief. The immune response that can be caused by the virus can be extremely severe, acutely, and maybe quite long-lasting. The risk-benefit is, a bit of a no-brainer. I would think definitely better to have the vaccine than suffer the illness. But the fact that people have been infected and are experiencing these long-term consequences in terms of mental health and cognition, planning, thinking clearly about the future. A lot of people are reporting this experience of kind of brain fog, that they don't feel that they've quite got their head screwed on straight after an experience of coronavirus infection. This is a really important clue and needs following up and understanding more deeply, and could be related to the immune response to the virus.
So I don't want to use the word fortuitous, but as you say, it does accelerate research. There's a greater reason now to conduct this research.
It does, yeah. I mean, one hesitates to sort of talk about the upside of COVID because I think, overall it's been a disaster. But if there is an upside, this is an example of it. It has mobilized tremendous medical research, energy, and collaboration across the world, and it is getting people to shift their thinking about how an infection of the body could have an effect on your mind, and it's not just because you're thinking about it in the wrong way. It's a sort of more direct biological connection. It's interesting, because if you look in the medical textbooks or you talk to patients, the idea that an infection might have, consequences in terms of mental health. I mean, there's a lot of examples of that. I mean, many people who have chronic fatigue syndrome, are convinced that their symptoms date back to a viral infection, and it's medically and in terms of research, it's been difficult to really get to the bottom of that. But with coronavirus, we have large numbers of people being infected, we have the opportunity and the resource potentially to look into it in greater detail. And I think if we can understand how the virus causes longer-term mental health and cognitive changes, I think that could have implications for how we think about post-infectious, mental health and cognitive issues in general, not just in relation to coronavirus, but potentially in relation to many other infections too.
Mm. We're going to take a short break now, Ed. You're listening to Crack the Podcast with me, Sandy Sedgbeer, and my co-host, Rebecca Shaper. And our guest this week is world expert in neuroscience and mental health, Professor Edward Bullmore, whose best-selling book, The Inflamed Mind, A Radical New Approach to Depression, outlines a future revolution in which treatments could be specifically targeted to break the vicious cycles of stress, inflammation, and depression. We'll be back with more from Professor Bullmore after the break.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Worried about your friend but don't know how to reach out?
You could say how are you or get a fake tattoo. You could ask with an app if it works for you. You could chat with them in VR. It's all good if you think you should check in. Yeah, you should.
Whatever gets you talking. Reach out to a friend about their mental health. Whatever gets you talking. Learn how you can help at seizetheawkward.org.
Welcome back.
So my next question to you is, you mentioned in your book that depression is heritable, that the risk is increased approximately threefold if both parents are depressed and twofold if one or more siblings are depressed. What about inflammation? Do our genes play a role in that?
Well, very good question. I think that if I can just start with the heritability of depression. So the fact that it runs in families, again, we've known that for a long time. What we haven't known until very recently is which genes in particular might be important. And, it's one of the exciting things that's going on in mental health more generally, I think, at the moment. We are beginning finally to see these genes come through now. Both for depression and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and many other heritable mental health problems. And it's a key question for us, thinking about the links between inflammation and depression, to look at those genes and try and understand other risk genes for depression. Do they have anything to do with the immune system? And we're working on that at the moment. There is some early evidence that that is indeed the case. So there was, I think, a very important paper just published a couple of months ago showing that the risk genes for depression have an effect on the levels of an inflammatory protein in the blood called C-reactive protein, or CRP. And that's a really important piece of evidence, because it's, I think, one of the first examples of a clear link between the genetics of depression and changes in inflammation. So to circle back to the question you asked me in the first place, are the genetics of inflammation emerging? Yes, they are, and of course not just in relation to depression, but across a range of different autoimmune disorders, inflammatory bowel disease, many other autoimmune disorders. The genetics are becoming clearer, and we know that's going to be very important. But what is particularly exciting from my point of view is that the genetics of depression turn out to be related to inflammation as well. And I think that really is an important piece of evidence in favor of a causal link between inflammation and depression. If the genes, you come into the world with the genes, so that's that's the first cause of everything biologically is your genes. And if you inherit genes that put you at risk for depression, and we now also know they're more likely to make you a bit inflamed, then clearly that's some strong supportive evidence that inflammation is on the causal pathway to depression.
Quick question. If you do come in, you can take a gene test to see if you have. Is there some way you can keep from not having that mental illness if you really took good care of your body, if you ate the right things? I'm just curious. Is there a way you can?
Well, again, that's an excellent question, and I think what it speaks to is, to my mind, is the interaction between the genes and the environment, between nature and nurture.
Yeah.
So, okay, we know that depression runs in families.
Right.
And we now know that there are something like 200 or 300 genes already identified that are relevant. But those genes, although they're all significantly associated with depression, when you sort of work out how much depression they account for, how much of the sort of inherited risk of depression they account for, they do not account for all of it. And a possible explanation for that is that what really matters is not just what you've inherited, but also what environment you're exposed to.
Yeah.
And if you have a certain genetic inheritance, and then you are exposed to, environmental stresses, you may be more susceptible to respond to those stresses in a way which is more likely to cause depression further downstream. So, although I think the genetics is really important and fundamental in this, my intuition is it's not going to be the whole story. Certainly for mental health, I think we are going to need to understand gene-environment interactions, to use the jargon, or to understand the interplay between nature and nurture, to put it, in a more ordinary way of speaking. And I think that is going to be important for inflammatory bowel disease, for example. I was talking to colleagues just the other day, and they say that in inflammatory bowel disease, it's the same story. The genes are beginning to emerge, but they don't account for all of the familial risk of inflammatory bowel disease. They think, for IBD, as for depression, that the environment interactions with a particular genetic constitution are really going to be important. So I think that's going to be a massive area of research for the future, is getting the genes and then understanding how those genes put you at risk of particular environmental exposures. The good news, if that plays out as I think it will do, is that it's modifiable, right? I mean, there's not much any of us can do about our genes.
Right.
But if you've got genes that put you at risk of a disorder, if you are exposed to, let's say, a particular diet or social stress, then that is something that you can modify. You can whatever your environment, or you can protect individuals that you know are genetically at risk from environmental exposures that might put them, into a clinical syndrome. So I think this is going to be very important for the future.
This is fascinating, just extremely fascinating.
Yeah. I want to come back to what you just said in a minute about, our genes. But first, given the amount of interest now that suddenly exploded in looking at depression, especially, with COVID, you were, I think, from 2005 to 2019, you worked half-time for GlaxoSmithKline as VP Experimental Medicine, focusing on immunopsychiatry. That was until they suddenly announced that they were no longer going to fund R&D research into anti-inflammatory drugs. What about now? Have they changed their mind now? Now that everybody's working together, have they suddenly said, okay, we need to, go back into this?
I don't think that GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, has yet decided to go back into it. But I think that there are companies out there. I mean, Janssen is one of them that are very interested in neuroimmunology. The interplay between the immune system and the nervous system. I think Lundbeck also has major interest in that area. And I think, I know pharmaceutical companies aren't everybody's, favorite organization, but I obviously would not have worked for a pharmaceutical company if I didn't think they were, a positive force for good on balance. And when I think about mental health, I think it's important that we have, big, well-resourced expert organizations looking for new treatments. So I've always wanted to do whatever I can to encourage people to think that this is a sensible place to invest and to look for new treatments. I mean, GSK and a lot of other pharmaceutical companies essentially exited mental health because, to put it bluntly, they weren't having much success. And I think one of the reasons that historically drug development has been particularly risky for mental health disorders is that the therapeutic strategy in mental health has tended to be more focused on, making symptoms better rather than addressing the root cause. And if you look across the rest of medicine, the real advances have come when you've shifted from treating the symptoms to treating the cause. If you wanted to make an analogy, the way we're treating depression at the moment is a little bit like the way people were treating fever back in the 19th century. Fever is a symptom, and there are ways that you can bring fever under control, even if you don't really understand the cause of it. But when we got breakthroughs was when people realized, actually, fever is a symptom of infection. Infection can be caused by a particular bacteria. We can take out those bacteria with an antibiotic. And then we're treating the cause of the fever. And that is where the breakthrough came. So pivoting back to depression, my argument, and I think a lot of people would agree with this in the industry and in academia, is that when we think about depression, we're thinking about a symptom or a syndrome of symptoms. And there could be many different ways to become depressed, right? It's not going to be necessarily the case that everybody is depressed for the same reason. What we need to do is get smarter about identifying the different causes of depression and then targeting our treatments to address the causes. Now, based on everything that I've already said and that's in the book, you won't be surprised to know that I'm interested in the idea that anti-inflammatory interventions, and that could be drugs or it could be other interventions, but I'm interested in the idea that anti-inflammatory interventions in general might have benefits in terms of treatment for depression, but I would never expect any anti-inflammatory intervention to be a kind of like panacea or a blockbuster in the sense that it's going to make everybody better. I think what I would hope is that it's going to be a significant advance in treatment for a subset of patients, for the particular group of patients in whom inflammation is the root cause of their symptoms. And I think if we can get that kind of shift playing out, then I think a lot of people would think it was looked like a better place to invest, and we get more industry interest, more investment. I think that will drive more therapeutics coming through. So that's my response to GSK deciding to get out of mental health back in 2010, was to sort of think, well, why did they do that? Because these aren't stupid people that are making these decisions. Why did it look like a bad risk? And I think it's because the strategy was kind of blockbuster orientated, one size fits all. And if we can get the science to help us think about treating causes rather than symptoms, I think that will make the field look a lot more attractive again to industry. So that's the way I think things should hopefully play out in future.
I'm curious, a person who has schizophrenia or psychotic episodes, is that different versus a person who's depression dependent on the inflammation in the body? I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, I think they are very different, they're very different syndromes, very different, you can be quite severely depressed without experiencing symptoms of psychosis. And of course, the cardinal symptoms of psychosis are delusions, false beliefs, and hallucinations, seeing things that aren't really there.
Right.
And some people who are very severely depressed can have those experiences, but actually most people who are depressed don't.
Right.
They don't lose contact with reality or experience things that aren't really there. Schizophrenia is characterized by those symptoms. You can't have a diagnosis of schizophrenia without psychosis, without delusions and hallucinations. But schizophrenia is also associated with, and perhaps this is a little bit less well recognized, but there are also many other symptoms of schizophrenia. People become less sociable. They tend to be more isolated. They may lose initiative. They may lose the normal range of mood. It's not like they become severely depressed or manically excited, but the normal day-to-day fluctuations or minute-to-minute fluctuations even in mood that we all experience tend to be flattened out a little bit in people with schizophrenia. And the other thing about schizophrenia, which is distinctive, is that the long-term outcome tends to be less positive. Most people with depression will recover from it. The outcome in schizophrenia is less certain, and certainly in this country, many of the people with long-term mental illness are people with schizophrenia. So in psychiatry, it's regarded as one of the most serious and severe diagnoses. But all that said, all those clinical differences, is there any evidence that schizophrenia could be related to the immune system? There is some evidence emerging, and I think when we think about how the immune system might play into schizophrenia, we have to do a sort of a mental exercise that's a little bit more challenging, perhaps, than when we're thinking about the relationship between the immune system and depression, because we know that schizophrenia is it's a developmental disorder. And I think some of the most interesting clues we have about the immune system in relation to schizophrenia suggest that it's very early life exposure to infection is what's important for schizophrenia. What happens when you're a fetus in the womb?
Yeah.
whether your mother is exposed to infection while she's pregnant with you, or whether you have exposure to an infectious illness very early in life. I think those episodes of inflammation and immune response are probably going to be more important in thinking about where schizophrenia comes from than when we think about depression. In depression, inflammation looks like it plays a role, even if you're inflamed for the first time in later life. Whereas I think in thinking about schizophrenia, it's probably more. You probably need to think more about the sort of developmental process and the exposure that people might have had to infection or inflammation at a very early age.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I want to come back to your comment about, genetics and our genes. I am fascinated by the placebo effect. And I've long thought, well, why isn't somebody studying that? And I believe that studies are being done now at Duke University. Do you think that it is possible, mind over matter, the power of positive thinking, even visualization, which I know is often being used with cancer patients, do you think they may be tools that could be helpful to people who maybe have a genetic predisposition and want to make sure that they remain healthy, or to reduce inflammation in their own body?
Well, I mean, I just perhaps state the obvious. I don't think there's any way that your mindfulness or state of mind can change your DNA. So I think what you inherit is what you've got. But I think that it is an interesting question to consider whether, psychological treatments or meditation or other lifestyle practices. I mean, yoga, for example, Tai Chi. A lot of these ways of changing one's state of mind could have effects on one's body. And again, going back to what we were talking about a while ago, this traditional split between mind and body. If you'd asked me 10 or 15 years ago, could meditation have an effect on your immune system, I would have thought, no way, that's impossible, because those are two completely separate things. But as we understand more and more about, the constant crosstalk, the communication between the body and the brain, it seems conceivable to me that, this meditation, for example, yoga, mindfulness, might well have effects on the body. What we need is data. Because where I think we're at the moment is, or at least where I'm at the moment, is that, that idea, which I would have thought was, inconceivable 10 or 15 years now, is now conceivable. I can believe it might be the case, but what we need to see are data.
Yes.
And really good studies looking at the effects of these kind of lifestyle changes on the immune system. And I mean, it's not just meditation, for example. I mean, there's a lot of interest in diet. What does diet do to inflammation?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And, that's an area that a lot of people feel very strongly about. And, I'm a lot more open-minded to that now than I would have been 10 or 15 years ago. But still, I think we need data. We need proper, we need to look at it scientifically and not just rush to believe that it is the case. So, when I look around, there are a lot of books out there on anti-inflammatory diets, for example.
Yeah.
And when I look at them with a possibly sort of skeptical scientific eye, I don't see much evidence in most of those books that any particular diet has, a definite, demonstrated, proven effect on the immune system. I'm not saying that it couldn't, but I think we need to stay reasonably critical about this. and make sure that, if we're going to be advocating to patients in the future that they can control their immune system, whether it's by meditation or by a dietary change, we're making that recommendation based on evidence and not just out of wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Do you think supplements play a role?
Well, I mean, I think it's, when I think about the role of diet, it tends to get quite wrapped up with the microbiome in my mind. So, the gut, if you think about the gut, it's absolutely packed full of bacteria, germs, to put it bluntly, and what you eat modifies, changes the popular level of in your gut. So supplements, yes, but maybe also other dietary ingredients are likely to change the constitution of the microbiome. And I think from the point of view of the immune system, that's going to be important, because if your immune system, which is very, very strongly represented in the gut, I mean, the gut wall is full of immune cells sort of defending us against the bacteria in the gut all the time. If the immune system picks up that the bacterial population has changed, it could well see, the immune system might well regard that as a threat or a reason for an inflammatory response. And that could be relevant to the effect of dietary change on mood change. Again, I'm being slightly vague here because I think this is a really important area for research. And as I've said already, this is the sort of stuff that if I think back to when I was at medical school, or training as a doctor 30 or 40 years ago, somebody said to me then, do you think dietary supplements or any other dietary change has got could possibly affect your mood? I'd say absolutely no way. There's no evidence for that. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that it couldn't have an effect. It's quackery, is the way that we were taught to think about these things. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to explore in my own mind and communicate to others that I think that way of thinking is out of date scientifically, and there are different ways of thinking about how diet is related to our immune health and our mental health. And we need to explore those and think about them, test them as rigorously as we would any other scientific idea. But it's conceivable, and to me that's exciting. It just opens up new ways of thinking about things that I think could offer a lot of benefit to people in the long term.
Ed, we've only got a few minutes left. I would like to ask you about the vagus nerve. Yes. We had somebody on a few months ago who'd made a documentary called Wounded Heroes, where he was looking at all kinds of non-drug related treatments for veterans with PTS. And one of the ones that was shown on the video that we saw was somebody having something done to their vagus nerve. Yeah. And the change was dramatic. Yeah, absolutely dramatic. So could you just say a couple of little brief bit about that before we have to bring it to a close?
Well, I know I've got to be very brief, but I think that is the vagus nerve. To me, is an example of the new science that's emerged. So we now know, which we didn't, that the vagus can have anti-inflammatory effects, and that the vagus is sensitive to the levels of inflammation in the body. So the idea that by stimulating the vagus nerve, you change the body's level of inflammation. I think that's quite well established now. And we need to think and explore in greater detail what that means therapeutically. But yeah, I mean, the vagus is an excellent example of something that we thought we knew about. It turns out we didn't know everything. And one of the things we need to take into account when we think about the vagus is what it's doing in terms of picking up inflammatory signals and then trying to damp them down. And if we can sort of use that feedback loop to help people control inflammation, that could be important.
Could you quickly show where the vagus nerve is for the listeners?
Well, when people put the stimulators in, they usually try and put them close to the spine. The vagus goes close to the spine as it leaves the brain and goes down with the body. But the vagus is very extensive. It innervates pretty much every organ of the body. The heart, the lungs, the gut, and the immune system, it turns out, all have quite a lot of input from the vagus. And it's a very important way of the body keeping its own balance, and making sure that the gut and the heart and the brain all stay roughly within the normal operating limits, if you will.
Wow. I wish we could talk longer, but unfortunately we are out of time. But there's a lot more about the vagus nerve in your book, and I would heartily encourage anybody to read that. Rebecca, any final words in about 5 seconds?
Would love for you to come back when you get more research.
Yeah. I'm delighted to come back and talk to you again. Thank you both very much.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you. Okay, that's it. We'll be back at the same time in 2 weeks, but please look on the website. There is more information about the book, more information about Ed, and the book is called The Inflamed Mind, A Radical New Approach to Depression. Go out and buy it. That's it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.